that you will take these types of prayer, and of course I will have them so they'll be available on the web, and use them and have them become a part of you and a part of your daily practices, because these are prayers that in the midst of messiness, in the midst of craziness, these are prayers that provide centering, that provide grounding, that connect us to God, that help us to tune into that right frequency, that help us to reflect on what God is doing, where God is leading, what God would have us to do in individual moments. And so our third type of category is listening, making space to hear what God is saying. So if you've heard me talk right now, you might say, okay, well, Jo likes to speak a lot, and she had all of these great things to say about speaking with God, and maybe her reflecting, okay, it was all right, and that's something that takes practice, but here we are at listening. And to me, listening is the hardest part. It is the hardest thing for me to do. This is what takes the most practice for me. And everybody is different. It's not a one-size-fits-all, as I said at the beginning. So maybe listening is the easiest for you, and maybe speaking or reflecting is more difficult. But listening. I'm good at telling God the things that I need. I'm good at praising God for all the amazing, amazing things that God has done in my life. But sometimes, often, I forget, or I don't make the space to stop and to listen. Now, listening and reflecting may seem similar, and they are similar in some ways, but reflecting is really being aware of God, being aware of how God is moving in our lives. But listening is taking that space and waiting to hear what God is saying to us, how God is leading us. So our next slide. Oh, actually, let me back up for a second. So for me, listening is that hardest part. I got confused on where I was. I heard a story. I don't know, and I don't speak French. You may have noticed that when I was talking about chocolat. That this is a story of a French woman. She was born in 1648 in France, and her name is Madame Jeanne-Marie Guyon. Hopefully I didn't murder her name. But she sought God in so many ways in her life. And over the course of her life, she produced some 40 volumes of spiritual writings in a time long before computers. So this is her story of how she really came to know who she was and reflecting on where God is in her life. Jeanne Guyon's spiritual pilgrimage began as a teenage girl, when, though wealthy and widely admired for her beauty, she hungered for something more. Coming from a deeply religious family, she felt dissatisfied with the rituals and mandates the church had handed down. And after experiencing a series of tragic events, she began crying out to God, yearning to know what it might mean to hear his voice or experience his touch. Devoting herself to the pursuit of holiness, she looked everywhere for someone who could tell her the secret of communion with Christ. One day, a Franciscan monk, after having spent several years in solitude, showed up on her family's doorstep, feeling certain that God was going to use him in the conversion of some significant person. Jean's father, knowing of her spiritual quest, invited her to come and meet the man. After Jean shared her struggles and her numerous attempts to connect with God, the monk bowed his head, remaining silent for some time. Finally, he said to her, "Your efforts have been unsuccessful, madam, because you have sought without what you can only find within." What you can only find within. Accustomed to seek God within your heart, and you will not fail to find him. You have sought without what you can only find within. Accustomed to seek God with your heart, and you will not fail to find him. It is stopping and taking that time to reflect, that time to listen, a time to make space for God that is so difficult. We have built into our regular weeks a day of Sabbath. And I know that all of you are regular church attenders. You wouldn't be here on a Saturday if you weren't. But we don't employ that day of Sabbath anymore in quite the same way as I think God intended it for us. Now, others have taken it to another extreme, making it too legalistic. In the Jewish culture, if you are an Orthodox Jew, what can you lift and what can you not lift? Is turning on a light switch considered to be work? And I don't know that many Jewish people and haven't talked to any Orthodox Jews, but to me, following all the laws might seem to be more of a burden than turning on the light switch itself. But there is this spirit of Sabbath, the spirit of taking time away, the spirit of having a day, having a half day, of devoting yourself and all that you are and all that you do to connecting and being and living in the presence of God. Sabbath is an important thing, and maybe we don't have time to take it weekly. I know many Sundays are filled with soccer games and appointments and basketball games, and you name it, and it happens on a Sunday. I work with youth, so I know that it's a hard thing to get people back into church after a Sunday morning, competing with what the world has to offer. And perhaps we can't take a full day of Sabbath each week, but taking time for Sabbath, taking time to set aside to listen for what God is saying, to really live and dwell and just truly experience God, that connection, that rest, that rejuvenation, being attuned to what God is saying and what God is doing. Sabbath is such an important part of our lives as Christians. God set aside one day and made it holy, and it is a day that we are to praise and worship and glorify our God. And I don't think we do that enough as a culture of Christians, that we don't take enough time to praise and worship and glorify God in the ways that are truly meaningful to us, the ways that really center us in God's presence. Ministers do have an added benefit of being able to take retreats and go away to conferences on spirituality and Sabbath, and to have that time to dwell in God's presence. But then again, sometimes it's harder for us who are trying to be the ones who have to model Sabbath. But it is an important thing for all of us. We do have centers and resources even in this area where you can go and you can take a Sabbath day. You can take a Sabbath afternoon. Maybe it's as simple as going to Jordan Lake and walking on the trails, or being out on a boat on the lake. There's something to be said for being outside where the walls don't close us in, to be in the nature that God created. It's definitely not a requirement, but I know that many of my most spiritual moments, many of the times that I have felt most connected to God, have been times that have been outside, experiencing the creation and the beauty that God has provided for us. Sabbath time is so important.